This changes everything. No. It can't be.
Ethan?
There are moments in life when a single decision changes everything. Not gradually, not over years. Instantly. One step, one choice, one moment that divides a person's life into before and after. On a bright Saturday morning in New York, hundreds of guests filled one of the most expensive wedding venues in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed to stretch forever. Thousands of white roses lined the aisle. Luxury cars crowded the entrance. Cameras flashed. Friends laughed. Family members whispered excitedly. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked exactly the way a billionaire wedding should look. And yet, something was wrong. At the center of the room stood Ethan Carter, 32 years old, only son of billionaire businesswoman Victoria Carter, future owner of one of the largest private companies in America. A man who could buy almost anything he wanted. And on that morning, he was supposed to marry the woman everyone believed was the love of his life. The guests waited. The musicians waited. The bride waited. But Ethan wasn't looking at the aisle. He wasn't looking at the guests. He wasn't even looking at the woman he was about to marry. Instead, he stood frozen, staring at a single piece of paper trembling in his hand. A letter. Just one letter. The kind of letter most people would read in a few seconds and forget. But this letter had the power to destroy an entire future. Witnesses would later say, Ethan looked as if he had seen a ghost. Others said it looked like he had suddenly remembered something he had spent years trying to forget. No one knew the truth. Not yet. The room grew quieter. The bride smiled nervously, then checked her watch, then smiled again. Still, Ethan didn't move. He continued staring at the page, reading the same lines over and over, almost as if he hoped the words would change. But they didn't. And then something happened that nobody in that room would ever forget. Ethan folded the letter, placed it carefully into his jacket pocket, took a slow breath, turned around, and walked away. No explanation, no speech, no apology, just silence. One of the wealthiest men in America abandoned his own wedding and disappeared from the venue before anyone could stop him. The bride stood frozen. Guests rushed to their feet. His mother's face turned white. The musicians stopped playing. The cameras kept recording. And within minutes, rumors began spreading through the room. Some believed another woman was involved. Some thought Ethan had suffered a breakdown. Others suspected a hidden family secret. But every theory was wrong, because the truth was far stranger than anyone could imagine.
The reason Ethan Carter walked away from everything that morning wasn't standing inside that ballroom. She wasn't rich. She wasn't famous. She wasn't powerful. In fact, most people would never have noticed her at all. As confusion spread through the wedding venue, a photograph appeared on several phones belonging to members of Ethan's inner circle. A simple photograph. Nothing glamorous. Nothing extraordinary. Just a woman wearing a cleaning uniform. No designer clothes, no expensive jewelry, no luxury lifestyle. Only a small smile, a quiet face, and eyes carrying a story nobody had bothered to understand. Her name was Sophia Brooks, and 3 years earlier, Ethan Carter had created a secret test. A test designed to answer one question. A question that had haunted him since childhood. How do you know if someone loves you for who you are when your last name is worth billions? He believed he had found the perfect answer. He believed he could expose greed. He believed he could identify loyalty. He believed he was smarter than everyone around him. But the test he created would eventually cost him the one thing he wanted most. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. because what happened next would prove that intelligence and wisdom are not always the same thing. And by the time Ethan finally understood the difference, the woman who had changed his life was already gone. 3 years before that abandoned wedding, Ethan Carter was living a life most people could only dream about. He owned luxury cars he barely drove. He lived in a penthouse overlooking Manhattan. He traveled on private jets and attended events where powerful people fought for a chance to shake his hand. Yet despite all the wealth surrounding him, there was one thing he could never buy: trust. Ever since he was a teenager, Ethan had watched people change the moment they discovered who he was. Teachers treated him differently. Friends suddenly became generous when they needed favors. Women who barely noticed him one day seemed fascinated by him the next. At first, he enjoyed the attention. Most young men would. But as the years passed, the excitement faded and something else took its place. Doubt. Every compliment felt suspicious. Every friendship felt conditional. Every relationship came with a question he couldn't answer. Would they still be here if they didn't know my last name? The question followed him everywhere. When he was 26, he entered a relationship with a successful model who constantly posted photos of their vacations online. When the relationship ended, she sold details of their private life to a celebrity magazine. A year later, another girlfriend secretly recorded conversations inside his penthouse and leaked them online after an argument. By the time he turned 30, Ethan had become convinced that love and money could never exist together. His mother, Victoria Carter, disagreed. Victoria had built her empire from almost nothing. She understood human nature better than most people. One evening, while having dinner in her penthouse dining room overlooking the city skyline, Ethan explained his frustrations. "I don't think real love exists when people know what you have." Victoria listened quietly before placing her glass on the table. "That's because you're looking for certainty." Ethan frowned. "What's wrong with certainty?" Victoria smiled. "Everything. People reveal themselves over time, Ethan, not through tests." But Ethan had already stopped listening. Because somewhere inside his mind, an idea was beginning to form. An idea that seemed brilliant. An idea that would eventually change everything. Several months later, Ethan arrived at Carter Holdings headquarters without security, without luxury clothing, and without the famous Carter name attached to him.
Let's see, who will notice cleaner?
Using a completely different identity, he accepted a position inside his mother's company. Not as an executive, not as management, not even as an office assistant. He became a maintenance worker. Most employees never looked at him twice, and that was exactly what he wanted. For nearly 2 years, Ethan observed people from the shadows. He repaired broken equipment, cleaned storage areas, delivered supplies, listened to conversations, watched interactions. The experience shocked him. People who preached kindness often treated service workers with disrespect. Employees who talked about honesty frequently lied over small things. Managers who spoke about teamwork took credit for work they didn't do. The longer Ethan observed, the more cynical he became. Then one rainy Tuesday morning, everything changed. He was carrying a box of files through the lobby when someone accidentally bumped into him. Folders exploded across the floor. Documents scattered. Dozens of employees walked past. Some glanced down. Most ignored him completely. A few even stepped over the papers. Then a woman stopped. Without saying a word, she knelt beside him and began gathering documents from the floor. She wasn't dressed like an executive. She wasn't dressed like management. She wore a simple cleaning uniform, Her name tag read Sophia Brooks. When Ethan thanked her, she smiled, not the kind of smile people gave wealthy men, not the practice smile used during networking events, just a normal smile, genuine, brief, and then she returned to work. Ethan found himself thinking about that interaction for the rest of the day. The next week, he saw her again in the company cafeteria, then again in a hallway, then outside the building during a rainstorm when she offered half of her umbrella to an elderly employee walking to the bus stop. Little moments, small moments, moments most people would never notice. But Ethan did. And what fascinated him wasn't what Sophia did when people were watching. It was what she did when nobody was watching at all. As weeks turned into months, they began talking during lunch breaks. Sophia never asked about his salary, never asked where he lived, never asked about connections. Instead, she talked about her father, a retired mechanic recovering from a stroke. Every evening after work, she went home to help care for him. She worked extra shifts, skipped vacations, put her own dreams on hold, not because anyone forced her to, because she loved him. For the first time in years, Ethan felt comfortable around someone. Comfortable enough to laugh. Comfortable enough to be honest. Comfortable enough to imagine a future. And that terrified him. Because while Ethan was slowly falling in love with Sophia Brooks, someone else inside Carter Holdings had started paying attention to him. A woman named Vanessa Reed. And unlike Sophia, Vanessa wasn't interested in who Ethan was. She was interested in what he was hiding. And once she discovered the truth, the game would begin. Vanessa Reed had spent years climbing corporate ladders. She understood something most people didn't. Information was more valuable than money. Money could be lost. Information could create money. That belief had guided nearly every decision she made throughout her career. Smart, ambitious, attractive, confident. Vanessa knew exactly how to present herself in every room she entered. The first thing that caught her attention wasn't Ethan himself. It was Victoria Carter. One afternoon, Vanessa noticed something strange. During a company event, Victoria walked through a crowded room filled with executives and board members. She barely acknowledged any of them. But when her eyes briefly met Ethan's across the room, there was something there. Recognition. It lasted less than a second. Most people never would have noticed. Vanessa did. From that moment forward, she started watching. A maintenance worker who somehow had access to restricted areas. A maintenance worker who occasionally disappeared into executive floors. A maintenance worker whose personnel records seemed unusually difficult to access. The pieces didn't make sense. Until one evening, they finally did. And when they did, Vanessa felt her pulse quicken. Because the man everyone believed was an ordinary worker was actually Ethan Carter, future billionaire, future CEO, future owner of everything. Vanessa never told anyone. Instead, she smiled, because she had just discovered the opportunity of a lifetime. At first, her approach was subtle. Coincidental meetings, casual conversations, friendly interactions, nothing obvious. Nothing suspicious. Slowly, she inserted herself into Ethan's world, and Ethan allowed it. After all, Vanessa was intelligent, confident, successful, everything society had taught him to admire. At first, Sophia didn't think much about it. Then she began noticing changes. Ethan started missing lunches. Their conversations became shorter. His priorities seemed different. When he spoke about the future, it sounded less like dreams and more like status, more like success, more like image. Sophia never confronted him. She simply listened and worried. One evening, while leaving work, Sophia saw Vanessa speaking with a private investigator outside a restaurant. She wouldn't have thought twice about it if she hadn't overheard a single sentence. "Are you absolutely sure it's him?" The investigator nodded. Sophia continued walking, but something about the exchange stayed with her. A few weeks later, she learned the truth, not from Ethan, not from Vanessa, by accident. A confidential file left open inside an executive office revealed everything. Ethan Carter, hidden identity, secret assignment, heir to Carter Holdings. Sophia sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes after reading it. Not because she cared about the money, because she suddenly understood why Ethan had entered her life. The friendship, the conversations, the connection. Had it all been part of a test? Had she simply become another subject in an experiment? For the first time since meeting him, Sophia felt hurt, deeply hurt. Yet she said nothing. She continued treating Ethan exactly the same way, because regardless of who he really was, the man she knew still seemed genuine. At least she hoped he was. Months passed. Ethan and Vanessa grew closer. The relationship moved quickly, very quickly. Meanwhile, Sophia quietly stepped back. Not dramatically, not angrily. She simply gave Ethan space. He noticed, but instead of asking why, he convinced himself she was simply moving on with her life. The truth was far more painful. Sophia had begun seeing things Ethan refused to see. Vanessa's questions were always about business, about investments, about ownership structures, about future plans. Never about people, never about family, never about values. Sophia wanted to warn him. Several times she almost did. Several times she stopped herself. Because what could she possibly say? That the woman he loved didn't love him? That she had a feeling? That something seemed wrong? Eventually, she tried anyway. One rainy evening, she met Ethan outside the building. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it would haunt Ethan for years. Sophia looked directly into his eyes and said something simple. "Just be careful who you're becoming." Ethan laughed, not cruelly, not intentionally, but he laughed, and that moment broke something between them. Because for the first time, Sophia realized he wasn't listening. Not really. A year later, Ethan proposed to Vanessa. The engagement dominated business magazines and social media. Everyone celebrated. Everyone except Sophia. She quietly resigned from Carter Holdings. No farewell party, no announcement, no drama. One day she was there. The next day she was gone. Ethan noticed. For a moment, he considered reaching out. Then wedding planning took over his life. And he never did. Months passed. The wedding approached. Everything appeared perfect. Until 6 days before the ceremony. That was when Victoria Carter discovered irregularities inside company accounts. At first it seemed minor. Then investigators uncovered more. Confidential files had been copied. Contracts had been leaked. Investment opportunities had been redirected. Millions of dollars had quietly disappeared. Every trail led back to one person, Vanessa Reed. Victoria refused to believe it. Then the evidence became impossible to ignore. Emails, bank transfers, private communications. Everything pointed toward a carefully planned operation that had begun years earlier. Long before the engagement. Long before the proposal. Possibly before Vanessa had even met Ethan. The woman Ethan believed loved him had spent years positioning herself for access. Access to information. Access to power. Access to wealth. And suddenly, Ethan understood something horrifying. The test he created had failed. Completely. The woman he trusted most had been performing a role, and the woman who had been genuine from the beginning was gone. Then Victoria revealed one final truth. One truth that hurt more than everything else combined. Sophia had discovered Vanessa's activities months earlier. She had attempted to warn him, repeatedly. Sophia had even submitted concerns anonymously through company channels. Those warnings had been ignored because Ethan trusted Vanessa more than anyone else, including Sophia, including himself. The wedding morning arrived. The evidence sat in a folder on Ethan's desk. The relationship was over. The future was over. Everything he believed about himself was over. Then came the letter, a simple envelope, forwarded through several addresses, written by Sophia months earlier. Ethan opened it alone. Inside were only a few paragraphs. No anger, no bitterness, no demands, just honesty. She wrote that she never cared about his money. She never cared about his name. She never cared about his inheritance. She cared about the man who shared coffee breaks, the man who listened, the man who laughed, the man who existed before appearances became more important than character. Near the end of the letter was a single sentence. One sentence Ethan would remember forever. I hope one day you learn that being seen and being valued are not the same thing. That sentence followed him all the way to the altar. It echoed through his mind as guests filled the room, as cameras flashed, as musicians played, as Vanessa waited, and ultimately, it was the reason he walked away. Not because he expected Sophia to return, not because he thought he deserved forgiveness, but because for the first time in years, he finally saw the truth. Money had never been the problem. Fear was. Fear had convinced him to test people instead of trusting them. Fear had convinced him to judge character through schemes instead of experience. Fear had blinded him to the person who had cared about him before knowing who he was. After leaving the wedding venue, Ethan drove across the city. Hours passed. Eventually, he arrived at Sophia's old apartment building. His heart pounded as he climbed the stairs. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Finally, an elderly neighbor opened a nearby door. Ethan introduced himself and asked about Sophia. The woman sighed, then delivered the final blow. Sophia had moved away months earlier. No forwarding address, no phone number, no social media, nothing. She was gone. Ethan stood in that hallway for a long time. Long after the neighbor closed her door. Long after the building became quiet. Because some losses don't happen when people leave. They happen when you finally understand what they meant. And by then, it's often too late. Maybe that's the lesson hidden inside this story. Not every valuable thing announces its value. Not every genuine person demands attention. And sometimes the people who change our lives the most are the people the world barely notices at all. So, here's the question. If you were Ethan Carter, would you have recognized Sophia before losing her? Or would you have made the same mistake? Let us know in the comments below.